In the autumn of 1825, a self-taught Boston carpenter named Solomon Willard walked the hills of New England on foot, tapping at ledges of rock with a hammer, looking for a stone hard enough to outlast the Republic. He was 42 years old, and he had just been handed the hardest commission in America. The country had voted to raise a great stone tower on the hill above Charlestown, Massachusetts, where the Battle of Bunker Hill had been fought 50 years before, and nobody yet knew where the stone would come from. Willard found his answer in a town called Quincy, about 12 miles south of Boston, gray granite ledge so dense and so stubborn that men had left it mostly alone for 200 years. To move that stone, an engineer named Gridley Bryant would build the first commercial railway this country ever chartered. 3 miles of track laid for one purpose, to drag the heaviest blocks of rock anyone had ever cut down to the water. I went looking for the full story of how a single New England quarry, split open by hand, became the granite that built a nation's monuments. What I found is hiding in plain sight, stone that millions of people walk past every year without ever asking where it came from. So let me show you what it actually took, and why one ledge in Quincy ended up underneath so much of the country. To understand why anyone went looking for that stone, you have to understand what the country was trying to build, and why it mattered so much to the men of that generation. On the 17th of June, 1775, on the high ground above Charlestown, a few thousand colonial militiamen had stood behind a hasty earthen redoubt and faced the finest army in the world. The British took the hill that day, but they took it at a cost that staggered them. More than 1,000 killed and wounded out of the redcoats who climbed that slope. The Americans lost the ground and won the argument. The battle proved that ordinary farmers and tradesmen would stand and fire and die against trained regulars, and the memory of it became one of the founding stories of the new nation. By the early 1820s, who had fought there were old and dying, and a group of Boston citizens decided that the hill could not be allowed to pass into private hands, disappear under houses. They formed the Bunker Hill Monument Association, and they resolved to mark the spot with something permanent, plaque, not a statue, a tower of solid stone tall enough to be seen for miles and built to stand for centuries. The form they chose was the obelisk, the tapering four-sided needle of stone that the ancient world had raised to mark its greatest places. It was a deliberate choice. An obelisk says permanence in a way nothing else does. It has no ornament to crumble, no soft material to rot, complicated structure to fail. It is simply a mountain of cut stone, balanced and stacked, pointing at the sky. The committee wanted the monument to outlast every man who built it, and every man who remembered the battle, and stone was the only material that could promise that. But an obelisk, on the scale they imagined, more than 200 feet of solid granite, had almost no precedent in America. The country had log churches and brick warehouses and a handful of stone public buildings. It had nothing like a hand-cut stone tower taller than any structure for miles around. To build one, would first have to find a mountain to cut it from. That is the problem they handed to Solomon Willard. Willard was not a trained architect in any formal sense. He had started as a carpenter, taught himself carving and drawing, modeled in clay, cut stone, and slowly turned himself into one of the most capable building men in Boston through nothing but work and study. When the design competition for the monument was held, the winning idea for the obelisk came in part from a young man named Horatio Greenough, only 22 years old, but it was Willard who was chosen as architect and superintendent on the 2nd of November, 1825, and it was Willard who had to make the thing real. And the first impossible piece of making it real was the stone. He needed granite that was hard, even in color, free of the flaws and seams that would split a block the wrong way, and available in pieces large enough to face a tower. So he went looking, ledge by ledge, across the granite country of New England, until he came to Quincy. The Quincy granite was a particular kind of stone, a dense gray rock that geologists would later class as a granite rich in the dark minerals that give it its color and its strength. It had been noticed before. As early as about 1803, a man named Newcomb Richards had opened the first commercial quarry in Quincy and begun selling building stone. The very thing that made Quincy granite so good for a monument, its hardness, was also what had kept it in the ground, brutally difficult to work. Softer stones could be cut with saws and simple tools. Quincy granite fought back. To split it, you had to understand it, and to lift it, you needed machines that barely existed yet. Willard understood it. He looked at that gray ledge and saw not a problem but the answer, the one stone in reach of Boston that could carry a tower 200 feet into air and still be standing when everyone alive had been forgotten. He bought into the quarry land. He moved himself to Quincy to live beside the rock, and for the next 17 years that ledge became the center of his life. And here is a detail about the man that says everything. For all of that work, all the years of finding the stone and inventing the machinery to cut and handle it and overseeing every block, asked the Monument Association for a salary of only $500 a year to cover his expenses. He was not in it for money. He never married, he poured himself into the granite, and when he died in West Quincy many years later, on the 27th of February, 1861, he left behind almost nothing in the way of property. He gave his best years to a tower and a ledge, and he took almost no pay for it. The man who fathered the American granite industry died nearly without assets, in the shadow of the very quarries he had opened. The cornerstone went down on the 17th of June, 1825, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, and the ceremony was one of the great public days in the young country's history. The Marquis de Lafayette, the French nobleman who had fought beside Washington in the Revolution, and who was then making his famous farewell tour of America as an old man, was there to lay the stone with his own hands. Daniel Webster, the most powerful orator of the age, at Ewan Hill, and spoke to a crowd of tens of thousands, with the surviving veterans of the battle seated before him. Think about who those old men were. 50 years earlier they had been young, and they had stood on that same ground and watched the British come up the slope in their lines. Now they were gray and bent, and a younger nation had gathered to promise them, in stone, that they would not be forgotten. It was a day of enormous feeling, and then the speeches ended, the crowd went home, and the actual problem began. Because laying a cornerstone is easy. You bring one stone, you set it with ceremony, you give a speech over it, quarrying, shaping, moving, and stacking 3,000 blocks of the hardest granite in New England, by hand, up onto a hill, across 17 years of weather and money trouble is not. The cornerstone was the promise. The next 17 years were the price of keeping it. Here is how they split the rock, and it is worth slowing down for, because almost no one today has ever watched it done. The Quincy quarrymen used a method called plug and feather, refined in those very years on that very ledge. First, a man would mark a straight line across the face of the granite where the block needed to break. Then along that line, drillers would bore a row of holes by hand, one man holding and turning a steel drill while another struck it with a heavy hammer, drill biting a fraction of an inch with every blow, the holes spaced perhaps 6 or 8 inches apart and driven down into the solid rock. Each finished hole the quarrymen set 3 pieces of iron, 2 curved shims called the feathers, one on each side, and a tapered wedge called the plug down the middle. Then a man would walk the line with a hammer, striking each plug in turn lightly, again and again, never hard, moving down the row and back again. The iron pressed outward against the stone with steady, patient force. You could hear the tone change as the wedges tightened, a ringing sound rising in the rock. And then after minutes of this, no great blow and no explosion, the granite would simply decide to part. A clean crack running the length of the line, block weighing several tons would break free exactly where the men had told it to. It was not strength that beat the stone, patience and iron, and an intimate knowledge of how the rock wanted to break. Once a block was split free, the real weight became the problem. These were not paving stones. A single-facing block for the monument could weigh 5 tons, and some weighed considerably more. To lift them out of the deepening pit of the quarry, the Quincy men used derricks, tall timber masts with booms and block and tackle and chains, anchored and guyed so they could swing a multi-ton stone up out of the ground and set it on a cart. A Quincy man named Almoran Holmes is remembered for inventing an improved hoisting apparatus in these years, the kind of practical machine that made the whole enterprise possible. But a derrick could only lift a stone. It could not carry it 12 miles to the harbor, and that is where the granite ran into its hardest obstacle, a simple distance between the ledge and the sea. Before there was any railway, granite moved the old way on the backs of oxen. A block of stone would be loaded onto a heavy wagon and a team of oxen would drag it, foot by foot, down rough country roads toward the water, wheels sinking, the road breaking up under the load. It was slow, it was crushingly expensive, and in the soft months of the year it was nearly impossible. A tower made of 3,000 of these blocks could not be supplied by ox cart alone, not in any reasonable time, not at any reasonable cost. Willard knew it, the Monument Association knew it, and so the granite forced the invention of something the country had never had. If the idea of moving impossible weight by hand in these same years is the kind of history you came here for, I want to point you to the story that sits right beside this one. The Erie Canal, dug across the whole width of New York State with shovels and wheelbarrows in exactly this era, is now a book, full illustrated account of how that ditch was cut by hand and changed the country. You can scan the code on your screen and start reading it tonight. The answer to the Granite's distance problem was the Granite Railway, and it is the one place in this story where a machine briefly steps to the front. The engineer was Gridley Bryant, a Massachusetts builder with a gift for solving physical problems, and the money came largely from a Boston merchant named Thomas Handaside Perkins, who organized the company and held most of its shares. The railway was chartered on the 4th of March, 1826, the legal right to take the land it needed for its route, and construction began that spring. By the 7th of October, 1826, the first train of cars ran the whole length of the line. It was 3 miles long, and it ran from the Quincy quarries down to a wharf on the Neponset River, where the heavy granite could be loaded onto boats and floated around to Charlestown. The railway itself looked strange to modern eyes, as it was a railroad with no engine. The cars were drawn by horses. The rails in the first years were heavy timbers topped with iron straps, laid about 5 feet apart on stone sleepers set deep in the ground, and later the wooden rails were replaced with rails of granite, capped again with iron. A single loaded car carried something on the order of 6 tons of stone. There was no steam locomotive anywhere on the line. The power was a horse walking, and the genius of it was simply that a horse pulling a heavy load on smooth iron rails can move many times what the same horse can drag through mud on a road. To bring the granite down from a higher quarry ledge, Bryant added an inclined plane in 1830, an 84-foot drop where loaded cars were let down a steep incline on a continuous chain, the weight of the descending stone helping to do the work. In solving how to move the Quincy granite, Bryant invented as he went. He is credited with the railway switch, the turntable, and the double truck car that could swivel to take a curve, basic pieces that every railroad in the world would later use. And in a detail that tells you everything about the man, he never patented any of it. He believed these inventions should belong to everyone. I want to be careful here because this is a film about granite, not about a railroad. The Granite Railway is famous, and it is often called the first commercial railway in the United States, the first chartered line that grew into a true common carrier without ever shutting down. That is a real distinction, and Quincy is rightly proud of it, but the railway was never the point. It was a tool the stone demanded. The granite was so heavy, and the distance to the water so stubborn, that the men building the monument had to invent a new way to move weight just to get the rock to the... The hero of this story is not the 3 miles of horse-drawn track. The hero is the rock itself and the hands that split it. The railway exists in this story only because the granite was too heavy for anything that came before it. So picture the whole supply line now, working together. High on the Quincy ledge, drillers bore their rows of holes and set their iron and listen for the ring of the breaking stone. Derricks swing the freed blocks up out of the pit and set them onto the railway cars. Horses draw the loaded cars down 3 miles of iron-capped rail to the Neponset River. At the wharf, the granite goes onto boats and floats around the shore to Charlestown. And there, at the foot of the hill, blocks come off the water to begin the last and hardest part of the journey, the climb up into the air. Every one of those 5-ton stones had to be lifted, course by course, higher and higher, as the obelisk slowly grew. In the early years, that lifting was done with derricks and ox-powered hoists and the patient labor of men hauling on rafts. There was no shortcut. A tower of stone goes up 1 block at a time, and every block weighs as much as a wagon. And then, with the granite quarried, and the railway running, and the first courses rising on the hill, the whole thing stopped. Because the money ran out. This is the part of the story that almost killed the monument. And it is the part that turns it from an engineering tale into a human one. By about 1828, most of the granite had been quarried and a good deal of it shaped. The funds to keep raising the obelisk had simply dried up. The association had spent itself nearly to nothing. The tower stood unfinished on the hill, a stub of stone perhaps 40 feet high going nowhere, and it stayed that way more or less for more than a decade. Imagine that. The greatest patriotic monument the young country had attempted, the tower meant to outlast the Republic, sat half-built and abandoned on a hill above Boston for years, an embarrassment, a broken promise in stone. At one low point, the association was so desperate that it sold off some of the surrounding battlefield land just to pay its debts, the very ground the monument was meant to protect. The granite was there. The men who knew how to cut it were there. What was missing was the will and the money to finish, and for a long stretch of the 1830s, it looked as though Bunker Hill might stand, forever as a monument to good intentions and nothing more. What saved it was not a rich patron or an act of Congress. What saved it, in large part, was the organized effort of American women, led by a writer named Sarah Josepha Hale. Hale was the editor of a popular ladies' magazine, a woman of enormous influence in the culture of her day, and she looked at the stalled tower as a kind of national disgrace. Beginning around 1830, she used her magazine to campaign for ordinary women across the country to give what they could to finish the monument. The idea met real resistance. Critics sneered that women had no business spending household money on a public tower. Hale pressed on anyway, and in September of 1840 she organized the answer, a great week-long fair in Quincy Market in Boston, where women from across New England and beyond brought needlework and art and preserved food and handmade goods of every kind to be sold for the cause. For 7 days the fair ran, and when it was over it had raised about $33,000, an enormous sum for the time, gathered $1 and a few cents at a stall, by the hands of women who would never have their names carved anywhere on the stone. The fair broke the dam. Inspired by it, 2 wealthy men stepped forward with the gifts that finished the job. A Boston merchant named Amos Lawrence pledged a large sum and issued a public challenge, and a New Orleans merchant named Judah Turo, reading of Lawrence's gift in a newspaper, sent $10,000 of his own to match it. Between the women's fair and these private gifts, the association suddenly had what it had lacked for 10 years, enough money to finish. Work resumed in May of 1841, and the obelisk that had stood frozen at 40 feet for a decade began at last to climb toward the sky. If you are new here, this is the kind of history you have been looking for. The quiet engineering and the named people behind the things we walk past every day. Take a second to subscribe, or to join the channel as a member for early access to every new film. The simplest way to keep work like this going. The man who drove the final climb was the chief stonemason, James S. Savage. To lift the upper blocks faster, he built a powered derrick, a steam-driven hoist with a movable boom that could swing the heavy stones up the rising shaft. I want to be honest about that because it matters. The granite was quarried by hand, split with drills and iron wedges, shaped by hand. Horses were raised the old slow way with ox power and muscle. But the last great push, the upper third of the tower, was lifted with the help of steam, because by the early 1840s steam power had finally arrived to do the heaviest lifting. The hands that mattered most in this story were the hands at the quarry, the drillers and the splitters and the stone cutters, who turned a mountain into squared blocks. Steam derrick at the top was the one machine that helped set those hand-cut blocks in place. Even with it, the work was dangerous. The records remember that one worker fell to his death during the construction, a man who went up to build a monument to other men's sacrifice and never came down. For most of the laborers on that hill and in that quarry, ledger gives no name, only a number. They were hired and counted and paid and replaced, and the tower they raised carries no list of them. The tower is their work, every squared and lifted stone of it. Then came the day they had waited 17 years for. On the 23rd of July, 1842, the last stone, the pyramid-shaped capstone, weighing about 3 tons, was ready to be set at the very top, 221 feet above the hill. A crowd gathered to watch. The steam derrick took the strain, and for about 16 minutes the capstone rose slowly up the face of the obelisk, turning gently in the air, the whole tapering tower of gray Quincy granite holding its breath beneath it. And riding on top of that capstone, 200 feet above the ground, was a workman who had volunteered to go up with the stone, a man who chose to ride the last block of the monument into place at a frightful height between heaven and earth. His name does not survive in the record I can verify, so I will not invent one for him. But he was there, on the top of the stone, when it settled into place, and the monument was at last complete. When the capstone was set, a salute fired, 1 gun for every state then in the Union, and the sound rolled out over Boston Harbor. The tower that had sat broken for 10 years was finished. The formal dedication came almost a year later, on the 17th of June, 1843, the 68th anniversary of the battle. Daniel Webster, who had spoken at the Cornerstone 18 years before, climbed the hill again as an old lion and delivered another of his great orations, this time to a finished tower instead of a hole in the ground. President John Tyler attended. A vast procession wound through the streets. The few surviving veterans of the battle, fewer now and much older than at the Cornerstone, were honored one more time, and above them all stood 221 feet of gray granite, every block of it quarried out of the Quincy ledge, split by the ring of iron wedges, dragged down a horse railway, floated across the harbor, lifted into the sky. Inside the tower, a stone spiral staircase of 294 steps wound up through the hollow shaft to a small chamber near the top, where a visitor who made the climb could look out over the city and the harbor through windows in the solid stone. It was the first great monumental obelisk ever raised in the United States, and nothing in the country had been built quite like it before. Every man who climbs those 294 steps today is climbing the inside of a hand-cut Quincy ledge. The whole monument had cost something over $120,000, a fortune for the time, and it had taken the better part of a generation. And it has not moved since. It is standing on that hill today, exactly as those men left it, same gray Quincy granite holding the same shape against the same sky. Now here is where the story opens up, and where the title of this film comes due, because the Bunker Hill Monument was only the beginning of what came out of that ledge. Solomon Willard, in finding and proving the Quincy granite, had done something larger than build one tower. He had launched an entire American industry. Once it was shown that this hard gray stone could be quarried in great squared blocks, moved by rail and water, and worked into the faces of major buildings, the demand for it spread across the whole country. Quincy granite became one of the most prized building stones in 19th century America. You can trace its path through the public landmarks of the age. Close to home, the same gray stone went into the Boston Custom House and into the great granite market buildings of the city, including the long colonnaded market hall built in Boston in the middle 1820s that still anchors the waterfront today, faced churches and public halls. In Quincy itself, the stone went into a handsome stone church, the United First Parish Church, finished in 1828, where two American presidents from the town are buried beneath the granite their neighbors had quarried, and then it began to travel. When the federal government built its great custom houses in the booming port cities of the 19th century, the stone of choice was often Quincy granite, shipped down the coast by sea. The enormous United States Custom House in New Orleans, one of the largest buildings in the entire country when it was begun, was sheathed in gray granite, carried all the way from Quincy, Massachusetts. Custom houses in Savannah, in Providence, in Portland, Maine, drew on the same ledge. The stone went into churches and banks and monuments in city after city. A single quarry south of Boston, opened with hand drills and iron wedges to build one tower on one hill, ended up standing in the walls of buildings scattered across the United States. That is the recognition I came here for. The next time you stand in front of an old gray stone custom house or a heavy granite church from that century, there is a real chance looking at the same rock that built Bunker Hill, cut from the same Quincy ledge, men using the same patient method of drilled holes and ringing iron. And the methods themselves became an industry. The plug and feather splitting, derricks, the hoisting machines, the granite railway, all of it pioneered or refined at Quincy in these decades, spread to quarries across the country and across the world. Quincy became known as a granite town, drawing thousands of skilled stonecutters from Scotland, from Ireland, from Italy, from Finland and Sweden, men who crossed an ocean to spend their lives turning that gray ledge into the stone face of America. They settled around the quarries, opened their shops and their churches, and made Quincy a place where a dozen languages rang off the rock. A few of their names did survive. Men like Carmine Cantelli, an Italian immigrant who came to work the South Quincy quarries as a blacksmith, sharpening the drill steel that other men drove into the granite all day long. For every name the record kept, hundreds of others did not survive. Drillers, and the splitters and the teamsters whose entire working lives were spent on that ledge. As the years passed, the pits went deeper and deeper into the earth. One of the great Quincy quarries was eventually driven down nearly 400 feet below the surface, one of the deepest open pits in the country, a man-made canyon carved one block at a time. For generations, the sound of the Quincy quarries was the steady ring of steel on granite, the same sound Solomon Willard had heard when he first tapped the ledge in 1825. The last of the Quincy quarries did not close until the 1960s. More than a century and a half after Newcomb Richards opened the first one. The pits the men left behind are a public reservation now, the cut walls of gray granite still showing the drill marks where the stone was split, and a museum keeps the memory of the granite workers who did the work. I think about what that one ledge actually represents, and I keep landing on the same idea. We tend to imagine that a monument is a single heroic object, tower that appears on a hill because the nation willed it. But Bunker Hill was not willed into being. It was dragged into being, block by 5-ton block, out of a stubborn gray rock that fought every inch of the way, drillers and splitters and teamsters and stonecutters, whose names mostly vanished, financed in the end by the small gifts of thousands of women who would never be carved into it. The granite did not care about the Battle of Bunker Hill or the Marquis de Lafayette or Daniel Webster's speeches. It only yielded to patience, iron, and to the steady ringing of hammers across 17 years. And once it had yielded, it spread out across the country in the walls of buildings that millions of Americans pass without a second glance. the most widespread and least recognized monument any of those workers ever built. Which leaves me with a harder question, and I am going to hand it to you. We honor the famous names attached to a monument like this: the architect, the orator, general the tower remembers. We carve those names into history, but the tower is made of stone, and the stone was won by men whose names the record did not keep, split by a method so patient and so quiet that it could be done with iron and a hammer and an ear for the breaking point of rock. So here is what I keep wondering. When you stand at the foot of the Bunker Hill Monument, or in front of any heavy gray granite building from that century, whose achievement are you really looking at? The man whose name is on the plaque, or the unnamed quarryman in Quincy who set the iron in the hole and listened for the ring? I have my own answer. I would like to hear yours in the comments, because I do not think it is nearly as settled as we like to pretend. If you want the deeper story of how Americans of this same generation moved impossible weight by hand, the Erie Canal dug across New York State with shovels and barrows in these very decades, the full illustrated account is waiting behind the code on your screen. Scan it, pick it up, and thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I will see you at the next one.